at the Kennedy Center. He has an office here, which allows us to see him daily, as well as interacting with him. He teaches development courses for us, brings a wonderful perspective for the students, and we've invited him to lecture to us today. His topic is Perspectives on Community Aid, so please join me in welcoming Assistant International Vice President Jan Van Orman.
Thank you. Jeff was supposed to say that mission that we served in was one of the 4 missions in the megalopolis of São Paulo. It was the last one organized, which means it was the leftovers. It was the miserable part of the city that no one else wanted to work. And so I was going to ask you how many of you might have served in such a mission, or perhaps worked with NGOs where you've had the chance to stare poverty right in the face. Just a few. Raise your hands a little bit higher here. I'm interested in that. Oh, I'm surprised there are so few. What does poverty look like?
Pretty ugly.
Pretty ugly?
Brutally real.
Brutally real. Anything else about poverty? How does it make you feel?
Very thankful for what I have and pretty embarrassed for all that I take for granted.
Okay, that's pretty good. What motivated my topic today was a meeting that I attended in this room about a month ago. And I appreciate your comments because there were a group of NGOs discussing how they could help. The interesting thing to me is the most enthusiastic of the NGOs represented was by an older man who had just recently retired and was very excited because the day before he had received the notification that his 501c3 status had been approved by the government, which means that anybody giving donations can write it off on their taxes, right? So he was ready to go. I said, "What's the objective of your NGO?" He said, "To get the most money to the most poor." And what occurred to me was, let's see, 1/5 of the world's population is at what the World Bank would call extreme poverty, earning less than $1 a day. 1.3 billion people. And half of all the children under 8 in developing countries are severely malnourished. Now I was kind of curious where he was going to start, getting the most money to the most poor. In truth, development agencies that have been in the business don't even try to reach the most poor, because their situation is so desperate that there's very little that can be done outside of welfare relief. But what I want to talk about today could be called development, and I deliberately avoided the title. Let me start with some sweeping generalizations about the current state of affairs. First of all, government-sponsored development programs are pretty well recognized at this point of having missed the target. There are, in fact, more poor people today than there were 50 years ago when we got in the development business. And secondly, we've seen dramatic, during our lifetimes, your lifetime, dramatic social reform. With the collapse of communism, you've seen a great expanse of liberal democracy, which has led to open markets, which has led to globalism as a worldwide phenomena. And with all of that, the distribution of income among people, even though there are more people with jobs, but the distribution of income is dramatically worsening. It's accelerating the inequality between the haves and have-nots. And the third area that is pertinent that you might ponder is private investment in international commerce has greatly increased and dramatically eclipsed all of the government and public sector efforts to deal with development and poverty. Nevertheless, with all that private sector investment, what's been created are, rather than solving old social problems, it's created new social problems. So my question today, and kind of the crux of what I wanted to talk about, was how do you help the poor? Now we have, and for those of you who are not completely familiar with NGOs, let me try and position them, because we have had since the beginning of time commerce. We've had engagement between people. And soon as they got organized, then we had a state and we had government. And so these new things called NGOs are clearly not government organizations, NGOs, neither are they for-profits. So they're not for-profits. And usually in this country, in North America, we call them either NGOs or not-for-profits. But In Europe, it's much more common to look at this third sector as a socially active sector, and some call it the new social economy. The term which I think is more elegant is private voluntary organizations, or PVOs. The bottom line on that is that there are people who are wanting to do good, like this gentleman who met in this room a month ago. Now, I've been curious how many NGOs we have in Utah, because there's quite a bit of clamor in our little state. And no one knows for sure. There are a few people who are doing surveys, but our best guess at this point is there are probably about 100 Utah-based NGOs who are working internationally. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of individuals who never register who are going off doing good. But in the country, there are tens of thousands. And one figure which I thought was descriptive, in 2001, so we're 2 years old at this point, in Chiapas, Mexico, with all that was going on there, at one point, there were registered 4,500 foreigners working with 276 NGOs in Chiapas. And you can be sure they were not working together. So, the problem that we have in addressing development is that NGOs have to find their place. Now, let me make a couple of statements about them and what they have done. First of all, they are probably an expression of the disillusionment which most people have with U.S. and multilateral development aid. The U.S. has been the biggest actor. Japan has been a huge actor in development. Europe collectively has done a lot. I found it interesting. In Germany, there's a religious tax, which has created massive organizations for the Catholics on one side and the evangelicals on the other side. And Ezedi and Miserior, the two large Catholic religious organizations, are very large actors in international development. But generally, people feel as though the state has missed the boat, or there's something not being done. So NGOs have focused the issue on human values. They put people at the center, not jobs or income or housing or benefits, but people are at the center. And so they're looking at giving people the capability of solving their own problems. Another attitude that we find in NGOs is that they have to use local resources. They don't have a lot of money like the government. So they need to be innovative. There is the reputation that NGOs are cost-effective, that they do more with less, that they're flexible, unlike government, that they can respond quickly to problems. In truth, I don't know that we've proven that to be true. But NGOs also are filling an important role as we have, again, the commercial side and the government side, as we have markets and we have state, with NGOs positioned in the middle. Now, the obvious role would be to mediate between the two. And we've seen over the last 25 years as NGOs have become effective that they're beginning to recognize their ability to do that. So, I just want you to be aware of the bottom line assumption, which is that if you expand civic action, okay, you expand society, people doing things, that strengthens democracy. And strengthening democracy will diversify and open the market, expand the market, so we go back to theories of market growth, which equals development. Expand civil society, democracy, markets toward a development future. Let's critique for just a second the NGOs before we move on to the real heart of the matter here. Because NGOs are competing for funds, they wind up with this little, I'm going to say, paranoia about them that leads to a sense of mistrust. And even among those in Utah, you can have them sit in a room and watch their reserve as they interact with one another, because many of them see the same funding sources as important to them. So unfortunately, it breeds a spirit of competition rather than unity. Also, NGOs, because they've come from a base that's more social-driven, have not until recently included people who are articulate in the language of development, which would be macroeconomics and econometrics. There are a few NGOs who are beginning to learn to dialogue with the large development agencies. But until very recently, they did not speak that language, therefore they were not able to interact with the big agencies and had no respect from the large funders. There's another thing about NGOs that Dave in particular here will agree to that raises many interesting questions, and that is they basically propagate our Western values, our Western view of what the world should be like. And also, they don't listen well to the language, the practical language of poor people. It's definitely time for a little example, so I'll tell you one of my favorite ones. And it was a large development agency I worked with that dealt with agriculture, among other things, and brought to the poor people in the interior section of Brazil some agronomists who came from grassroots. These were poor people from similar communities who had gone to school and gotten their degrees and then gone out to help the poor. And they kept trying to persuade the local farmers that they needed to plant their crops in the humid valleys of this desert region, because the humid valleys tended to be more fertile and, of course, more moisture. The people wouldn't do it. The agronomist would come, he'd persuade them, he'd show them results, and then he'd go away, and when he'd come back, there'd be no crops growing there, but they'd be growing over in the desert. And in the beginning, I didn't understand either. But after 3 years of working with this project, then came the always predictable drought, the great sertão of Brazil. And this drought was devastating, and the people had learned from their forefathers that you don't plant in the humid valleys until the drought comes, because when the drought comes, that's the difference between life and death. If you use up the fertility of those valleys in times of less need, you won't survive the drought. The people knew that, and even an agronomist from grassroots origins didn't understand. So it's hard to understand the practical wisdom of the poor, and there are very few that are skilled, however good they are at listening. A general failing of NGOs is that because they're small, they tend to find their own little projects or their own community. And I remember working in Honduras, and there were half a dozen U.S.-based development organizations whose objective was to save the children. And one of them was called that, indeed. Good organizations. But because they needed to show results and feel like they had some management over the future, they each would go off and find their own little villages. And here is a great potential resource that, having come together, could possibly have had a national impact, but instead was localized to small communities because of their vision of what they could do. So they're spread wide and thin. Finally, I will just say that NGOs don't really have much accountability. I mean, they don't have to account to anybody. People give money, they make reports, but they're not accountable to the beneficiaries they serve. There's no link. As in government, there's the government accounting office that eventually will catch up with you, or the opposite political party that will come and hold you responsible. But NGOs pretty well go where they want, when they want, and do what they want. So it gets us back to the bottom line question, which is how you help the poor. Now, I spent 25 years, and in that time, figure I reviewed over 500 projects. And I don't know, I can't tell you how many of those we funded, but I would say it was probably about 40%. And in the beginning, I was very uncomfortable with the God role that one pays as he comes in and he holds the purse strings, and the people are saying, we have this idea in mind. Please help us. They don't even need to say please, because you can see the need and you can feel the compassion. It's a hard role to play. But I soon learned, after I gained some experience, it's really not hard to tell where an intervention is appropriate. So, let's go into a little community. The last group that I visited before I retired from that line of work was a small group in Costa Rica on the edge of cane production, which was done mostly in plantations. But these little group of farmers on land which they had legal right to began planting their own cane and would try and sell their little small crop alongside the big guys. Now, I don't know if any of you realize that once you cut cane, that the chemical composition begins to change so that the sugars, which are what it's valued for, begin to turn to starch. So whoever gets their cane to market first gets the higher price. And the processing plants measure how long it's been from the time the cane was cut till the time you present it. And so when it's time to rush to the factory, who gets processed first? Yes. And these little guys were struggling, but they were making it. And so I remember this vividly because they had built themselves a little community center. What it looked like is it looked like 4 poles with a tin roof. This was a progressive, not a thatched roof, but a tin roof. And we met during the rain, and the rain was pelting on that roof so hard I could hardly hear them speak. But they came from their houses all around, through the mud, men, women, and children. And there they all were. And they didn't all fit quite under the roof, but there they all came to present to me their project. They had written a letter, knew of our organization, had written a letter, and I came. So, what would you do? How would you find out? How would you begin to ask, should we help this group?
I would make sure they had some form of like game plan laid out exactly their plan of attack, using what they know of their resources, what can they contribute to the project.
Okay, so they got a project proposal, right? Okay, project proposal. Now, a little village like that, would you have an idea that they have ever in their lives written a project proposal?
Well, they never would. Probably wouldn't have much of an idea. So.
Yeah, wouldn't much of an idea. So you wouldn't want to hold them too responsible for something really well developed that way. That's a very good idea. The way I start out is, well, yours is the second step. I have a first step. Anybody want to take a guess or have another approach? Yes. What they think they need. That's similar to the project proposal, right? What's your plan? The first thing I learned to do was to meet everybody. And I'd shake, how are you guys? Who are you guys? And I'd shake everybody's hand, the little kids and the old people, and sometimes it'd take 2 hours. And then the next question is, how'd you guys wind up here in this miserable place? You know, and everybody laughs, because it is a miserable place. And pretty soon, you're starting to understand the history of that community. Why they're there and how they see their community. And the trust is important, but far more important than that is the question. Whether it's just the community leader that's answering your questions, or whether it's everybody, whether the women are given as much opportunity to speak as the men, and whether the little kids are told to hush up, or they're all running around and everybody's taking care of each other's little kids. And when you see that going on, everybody participating and everybody sharing with each other's kids, there's a spirit that comes together, and you know you've got community. Now, with community, then the second thing is, and I didn't ever call it a project proposal, but I'd say, what's your story? What are you guys trying to do? That was a good question. And they'd usually have a story. And a group that has thought of what they can do and tried and gone to the limit of their own ability is the kind of organization who probably can benefit, will grow from an outside intervention. And my very presence there was an outside intervention. As soon as we send any money, it's even more of an intervention. If we send them a tractor or a computer, that's a worse intervention, because then they're stuck with technology, which soon links them to other dominating forces, like the guy that owns the gasoline pump and the guy who trains tractor drivers and has the parts for repair and stuff like that. So responsibility for your intervention is determined by the readiness of the community to act on its own. I always enjoyed those first visits. And always felt bad when I would say, I don't think you guys are ready for that. And sometimes we'd spend all day and spend the night and the next day talking through, well, now what happens if this? What happens if we send in this particular project, the sugarcane people thought, we're going to turn into industrialists. We're going to take our cane and we're going to boil it up and we're going to make rapadura. Anybody know what rapadura is? Rapadura is that little sugarcane candy. You boil off. The best part is the foam that bubbles up on the top of the cane when you're boiling it. And you scrim that off, and that makes a really good little candy for the kids. But rapadura is a block sugar candy that you eat if you're really lucky. And you can sell it in the local marketplace. Now, I knew perfectly good and well that these guys could make the finest rapadura in the world. and they could come up with the best price, and they could package it really carefully if they were clever. But that China coming in with a whole boatload of cheap candy from China, from cane most likely, could undercut them in the marketplace in a second. That there's no way that this was an economically feasible project over the long run. I also knew that cane was dying out in Costa Rica and in most of Central America, and the only reason it's there is because we still haven't figured out the trade subsidies between countries. Big countries like Brazil are dealing with cane because they turn it into alcohol for automobiles. But in Costa Rica, this was a dead-end project. So, what did I do? I funded the project. And the reason I funded the project was because I saw that that community, within its own knowledge and its own resources, this was the only next step that they could come up with which they could control. And taking that next step, even though that didn't lead anywhere, what it did is it got them engaged with one another in a production activity where they could learn what their resources were and who was willing to stick in that community rather than go outside and to try and make something happen. They could engage the local commerce in their area and begin to learn things that there's no way for them to learn except as they take that step. I also found and had occasional satisfaction from people who we would say, it seems as though this project will lead you to a dead end, when we would say no, that they would get angry and they'd have a big fight and they'd sometimes invite me back, to challenge me. But a few of those communities worked through, saw the problems, and changed their project proposals so they came out with something that indeed was more likely to succeed. So this is a process, and I want to talk to you about the principles that affect community aid. Let me begin, first of all, with a very quick thing, which is a little bit peripheral, but let's see if I can do this. This is an approach to development which has a strong overlay of LDS doctrine. We all start out with our agency, right? And then we see the basic government welfare program, which is an entitlement, and we now have third and fourth and fifth generations of Americans who are living on government welfare. The criteria to get aid from the government are fixed, and they're written down on a piece of paper, and you either qualify or you don't qualify. And I met last Sunday, being a bishop at the moment, with a member of my ward whose government welfare benefits, helping her train herself so that she can raise her kids, and she's done pretty well, but all of a sudden her government welfare benefits dropped to 20% of what they were last year because she had a little change in her own work. It encourages in many ways idleness, because as soon as people start to work, we're getting a little bit better with some of these things, but the dependency that's created because it doesn't build strong links outside and the ultimate resentment from people is quite well known. If we have in the Lord's own way, as tithe payers, many, many times, dozens and dozens of people who I have known who have needed welfare to get out of a situation have considered it a privilege and that they have a stake in it. And while it's embarrassing and awkward at times, it is something they can come in and say, by golly, I did put something into this when I was working, and I'm going to be most glad to put something into it when I'm working again. It's their personal circumstance by the judgment of a leader that determines when to help, how to help, not any kind of rigid criteria. Workers promoted, leading to self-reliance. And in the end, I think the gratitude that I appreciated your comment about having stared poverty in the face and being grateful for what we have. So that is a widely contrasting model. Let's move it international. We have a community. And I'm going to call it an organization. There are many communities that are really not well organized. But certainly some are more or less organized. So down toward the bottom of that, I want to draw a continuum showing engagement of the community, with less being up near the top and more organized being down near the bottom. The appropriate intervention in the beginning might surround something called a project or an activity or a goal that they have in mind. And clearly how well it's reasoned ought to do with how well it has succeed and whether there's an appropriate role for an outsider. But as the community is a little more organized, perhaps the involvement, the engagement should not be a project as much as to further a process which they have begun, so that would center not around creating jobs or manufacturing rapadura, but rather it might center around people educating themselves or sending members of the village outside to see what other communities have done. And that leads us to the most organized communities benefit, in my estimation, much more from linkages with the outside, developing resource information, than they do by a funder coming in and helping with the project. We have people on campus who have helped with projects. Anybody here been involved with the microcredit activities? We have a lot of BYU students involved with that. We have a member of staff who was involved with parachuting a bakery into Africa for a group of people who needed to increase their income. And so the resources to build the building and the equipment to make the bread and the whole process, and a bunch of bakers from Utah Valley went to Africa and built this big plant and taught the people how to bake bread. And the only problem was nobody in that village really wanted to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to start baking the bread. And in fact, they weren't used to wheat bread, the kind of bread that we eat here that the bakers from Utah Valley knew how to bake. And it struggled along for a few years as the well-intended NGOs from Utah kept sending in people and money and sustaining the thing till they finally realized all they'd done is created a dependency upon themselves. And so the appropriate role for an outsider is one that needs to be examined carefully in relation to the community's ability to act on its own. Now let's put another line alongside this, which talks about the objectives, or what the outcomes might be. Now, I didn't put a lot of detail on this, but I want to give you a notion. First of all, there are tangible objectives in most development projects because we're dealing with dire need. So we talk about jobs, or we're talking about housing, or food and water, and things like that are very basic to individuals. At this level, a less organized community responding with an interventionist attitude, what we wind up is doing things for people, helping provide them things they don't have. And they may feel they're things that they need. It's not necessarily we impose the goals of it, but the way you go about it is very linear, and it involves intervention. Now, if you move down the list to the bottom, where you have a more mature community, you get to intangible outcomes, more social type objectives. Now, let me just move down that continuum, because at the top, if we're talking about giving people things, and those things could even be education, as we get more toward the middle, we might talk about promoting participation, everyone's involvement in things, or the organization of smaller community groups. We might talk about leadership, strengthening leadership, and there are many ways this can be done. Even at a rudimentary level where people are not necessarily themselves. São Paulo, which has 4 missions because the city is so massive. We had 10 million people in our mission, ostensibly a fourth of the city. Well, there 10 million people move in every day into São Paulo. And 10,000 people move in every day. The numbers that the World Bank uses is that the percentage of the world's population that is at extreme poverty measured by income of less than $1 a day in real or in kind, the percentage has decreased slightly. The real numbers have increased from about 1.2 billion to 1.3 billion. Measured basically the same way. Yes.
Oh, sorry. That's fine. So you mentioned that there's a lot of disorganization in different groups in the NGOs that are involved, and although everybody has good intentions, it's just difficult to keep things together and organized and keep people communicating, especially on the higher financial, more people who need tangible results level. What have you seen work? What promise is there for better organization? Are there organizations that organize?
Well, when I came over today, my friend Don Holsinger, who spent many years at the World Bank, he sort of works the other side of the street, right? Say, from my grassroots community sort of focus. And our careers have paralleled each other, and he just called me he said, good luck with your lecture and tell them the truth. Now, I don't know what the truth is, but Don would certainly take objection to a few of my sweeping generalizations, or at least want to debate the content of them. Because if you take a macro view from the world level of a multilateral agency like the World Bank, you see problems differently. You define them differently, and you achieve positive results. The question is, do those results really change the lives of people at the bottom? Yes, some. But the population growth and the changing dynamics of the economy have created a poverty that's even more afflictive than the poverty that existed 50 years ago after World War II when we started all this business. So, on the part of many. But my friend who sat in this room and said, objective, most money to the most poor, he's got a steep learning curve. And he could go out like the bakers and get people all excited in a certain region and sort of disrupt their local life, and then kind of go off and basically leave things for naught. If that money and ideas and outsiders willing to help came in and tried to help us, and we're such a miserable lot that we couldn't pull it off, and so we really must deserve our current plight. Now that really angers me, and that happens every single day in NGO work.
It seems to me that most of what you've been talking about is how NGOs function and how they can function more effectively. What do you suggest for the average American who wants to help but doesn't work with an NGO?
Well, you know, if all goes well, my wife and I are anxious to go out and serve a mission again within a structure that I think is sensitive to, at the level where communities themselves can control how they're applied. Your question. Stay home. Help people down your street. And that may lead to something that will take you elsewhere. But by golly, if we learn to become the kind of people that we know we can be, where we really can not only be more gratified ourselves, but also be of greater benefit, blessed, the thing that we need to work with. It's kind of like a teacher. You know, they say teachers go in, they get to stand up in front and talk about something that they've studied, and everybody listens because they, you know, want to hear about that, and it's very gratifying to teach. And okay, yes, more. This is something. There are communities now. We're getting a little nervous about the church. Yes, who are organizing these things and getting their whole ward and pretty soon their whole stake. Let's raise money for. Completely unconnected to anything. Hinckley has not said. He said there's enough need, let people work. But the consequences are something that we have not an academic in a systematic way. So we have a new phenomenon, I think, Paul, that is yet unmeasured. I wish I could reach some conclusions, but I can't. I can observe the phenomenon and criticize the method.